All rise.
Molimo, ustanite.
The International.
Međunarodni krivični tribunal za bivšu Jugoslaviju sada zasjeda.
Please be seated.
Molim vas, sjednite.
Good morning to everyone in and around this courtroom. Mr. Registrar, would you please call the case?
Thank you and good morning, Your Honors. This is case number IT 0992T. The prosecutor was Ratko Mladić.
Thank you, Mr. Registrar. No preliminaries were announced, therefore we will continue to hear the final arguments. Mr. Weber, you may proceed.
Thank you, Your Honors. Good morning. Yesterday, we left off discussing the campaign and its impact on children in Sarajevo. This is where I will pick up today. By 1994, UNICEF reported that at least 40% of the children in the city had been directly shot at by snipers. 39% had seen one or more family members killed, and 73% had their homes attacked or shelled. That is Exhibit P7171, page 9. In addition to the sniping, the SRK attacked civilians in a shelling campaign that took many forms, including massive bombardments that blanketed the city, sporadic intentional targeting of civilian areas with just a few shells, and the deployment of modified air bombs. The SRK shells spared virtually no civilian part of the city. The prosecution has provided representative examples of each of these forms of shelling in paragraphs 922 to 1002 of its final brief. The SRK shells often targeted residential or commercial areas. The shelling struck hospitals and people attending funerals. SRK mortars hit civilians during everyday activities while collecting or queuing for water, shopping in marketplaces, or lining up for food or other humanitarian aid. Residential houses, mosques, and cultural landmarks were not spared. Instead, they were extensively damaged through VRS bombardments. Examples can be found in exhibits P1888, P6682, and P7683. After years of shelling with mortars, artilleries, and rockets, General Mladić actually increased the destructive capacity of the SRK in 1994 and 1995 through his deployment of modified air bombs that were indiscriminately launched into residential areas of the city. Mladić and Perisic conceived of these contraptions, and it was Mladić's personal approval that was necessary to launch them. The prosecution would further refer the chamber to paragraphs 749 to 753 of its brief for a more detailed discussion. Even some of the defense witnesses acknowledged the terrifying impact of the VRS shelling and sniping directed at the population. Kecmanović, at page 23881, confirmed that it was living with that sense that your city was being randomly showered with shells that terrified you. GRM 97 at page 40160 agreed that General Mladić wasn't above using terror as a weapon in targeting civilians. Even defense expert Kovic admitted to the chamber at page 41986 that the effect of the campaign in Sarajevo was terrorizing. turn to the defense brief and its take on the campaign. In its brief, specifically at paragraphs 1327, 1741, and 1800 to 1848, the defense denies that SRK did any of this and provides a fictional narrative of the accused's involvement in the events in Sarajevo. One where he is actually the heroic savior who made consistent attempts to ensure the safety of those in Sarajevo, going as far as to say he ensured their, quote, the well-being, welfare, unquote, of them. These statements could not be further from the truth. In support of this, the defense points to a few examples of Mladić's kindness during the campaign. Taking these in turn. The defense claims in paragraphs 1803 and 1804 that General Mladić offered the airport as a, quote, gesture of goodwill, unquote, to ensure the passage of humanitarian aid to the civilians, and in the same paragraph that he ordered not a single bullet was to be fired at the airport. These submissions are impossible to square with the evidence in this case that shows Mladić and Karadzic continually used humanitarian aid as a tool for leverage. Even after surrendering control of the airport to UNPROFOR, Karadzic threatened UN officials in September 1994 and said that, quote, in the event the arms embargo was lifted, the Serbs would take UN Blue Helmets hostage, shoot down a lot of planes.
Sorry, Mr. In the event the embargo was lifted?
Correct. The arms embargo at the time. Shoot down a lot of planes and arrest all foreigners, unquote. That is Exhibit P-840. Later that same month, while Mladić was present in Lukovica, UNPROFOR reported the VRS had received orders to open fire on all aircraft because Mladić wanted, quote, to show his determination to close the airport and restrain freedom of movement, unquote. That's P629. And then there's evidence of the SRK actually firing on planes, like the occasion in March 1995, where Akashi's plane landed in the airport and the VRS fired on it. That is P872, paragraph 99, and Exhibit P880. This portrayal is also impossible to square with Mladić's own SRK commander's response to protests about the deliberate sniping of civilians crossing the airport. In one such response, Galić expressly told Abdel Razik that if the civilians continued to cross the airport, his side would continue shooting at them. This can be found in P293, paragraphs 91 and 104. That is exactly what happened. When desperate conditions caused more civilians to attempt nighttime crossings of the airport in early 1993, anywhere between 5 to 30 civilians a night were shot by Galić's forces over a 2 to 3 month period. The shooting of civilians crossing the airport is discussed in greater detail in paragraphs 689, in paragraph 689 of the prosecution's final brief. This evidence also runs counter to the defense claims in paragraph 1836 regarding the freedom of movement of civilians. where they say the civilians of Sarajevo were, quote, always permitted, unquote, freedom of movement into and out of SRK-held territory, and they were, quote, never blockaded, unquote, by the SRK. The reality, of course, was different. General Mladić took pride in this fact, as demonstrated in the intercept mentioned earlier, where he stated that he had blocked Sarajevo from four corners, that the city was trapped, and that there was no way out. The reality is that the SRK blocked all of the roads into and out of Sarajevo. As already mentioned, civilians ran across the airport in droves, in desperate dashes for freedom, and the SRK shot at them with machine guns as they did. Access to the narrow tunnel eventually built under the airport was limited, and crossing through it was difficult, as defense witness Mladić himself acknowledged at page 23112. The lack of freedom of movement for the civilians of Sarajevo is also contradicted by numerous VRS orders, including Mladić's own directives, which repeatedly ordered the SRK to prevent the deblockade of the city and to tighten the circle. There are other examples, like the one now appearing before you on the slide. This is Exhibit P6523, an SRK tasking order from April 1994, where Mladić instructed SRK units to, quote, fortify positions around Sarajevo by erecting wire and concrete barriers, which would in turn strengthen the belief that they really are blocked, in parentheses, in a camp, close parentheses, close quote. This task obviously applied to both military and civilians within the SRK encirclement. As Colonel Dragicevic acknowledged, it was impossible for the SRK to surround ABIH forces in the city without also surrounding civilians and instilling this camp-like feeling with the use of concrete barriers and wire. This is at pages 23776 to 78. The defense makes a similarly outlandish claim in paragraph 1817 that Mladić, quote, did not support, unquote, or give any orders that obstructed the passage of humanitarian convoys. This chamber has received overwhelming evidence to the contrary. Mladić controlled and deliberately manipulated the supply of humanitarian aid and utilities throughout the campaign. He did this in order to restrict the flow of humanitarian aid within the city. According to Banbury, the VRS exercised total control over UN convoys, and General Mladić was very obstructive when it came to the delivery of humanitarian assistance. Fraser indicated that Mladić regularly restricted convoys and described how Mladić would sometimes use those convoys as pawns, as he, quote, would run you down to your last day of food, water, fuel, then show you who was in control by allowing a convoy in, unquote. That's P576, paragraph 137. Another example Fraser provided was when Mladić threatened to restrict convoys into Sarajevo if there was no apology for recent NATO airstrikes. When no apology came, Mladić closed all checkpoints into Sarajevo. This is at transcript page 5774. The defense next claims in paragraphs 1827 to 1829 of its brief that General Mladić took, quote, every action, unquote, to ensure the supply of water, gas, and electricity to Sarajevo, and that, quote, no orders were ever given, unquote, for the supply of services into the ABH areas of Sarajevo to be severed. These defense claims are flatly contradicted by the voluminous evidence in this case. Mladić himself even issued such orders. On the slide before you is now one such order. In Exhibit P7406, General Mladić unambiguously orders, quote, immediately stop supplying water, electricity, and gas to the Muslim part of Sarajevo, unquote. So orders were in fact given, and they came from the accused. Also, everyone understood how the VRS was using the utilities in Sarajevo, even local Bosnian Serb officials. For example, in P6714, the Serbian City Assembly of Sarajevo complained to RS officials about the damage caused to local Serbian households from, quote, the most recent using of Sarajevo for the purpose of raising and lowering tensions in the whole of former Bosnia and Herzegovina, in parentheses, the cutting off of electricity, water, and gas, close parentheses, unquote. Likewise, the defense's contention in paragraph 1809 that Mladić repeatedly offered to demilitarize Sarajevo and place all heavy weapons under the control of UNPROFOR is not accurate. This contention is invalidated by the circumstances, which include orders that subverted the relocation of weapons and show the offers were not made in good faith. The evidence shows that the main staff only agreed to the Total Exclusion Zone, or TEZ, as part of a number of military and humanitarian concessions to avoid threatened NATO attacks following Markali 1. The evidence also shows that the SRK had no intent to actually implement the TEZ. As internal orders reveal, they plan to remove inoperative weapons while hiding the operative ones. Orders from the main staff and SRK expressly refer to the relocation of weapons in 1994 as a, quote, diversionary tactic, unquote, and also state the inoperative weapons were removed, quote, in order to give the military observers the impression that they were withdrawing our heavy weapons, unquote. These are references to P730 and P4428. Another example is P2249. Moreover, the reduction of shelling after Markali 1 was accompanied by a spike in sniping. By March 1994, the level of sniping in the city was increasing. Both Thomas and RM 163 testified that after the creation of the TEZ, sniping became a more pronounced component of the campaign. The SRK resorted to this increased sniping against the civilian population because at that time they had temporarily lost their advantage of their heavy weapons. Now, the defense also cites VRS orders at various points in its brief and argues that these orders somehow show some type of reduced culpability or exculpatory behavior by the accused. For example, in paragraph 2437 of its brief, the defense states that Mladić, quote, strictly prohibited any offensive fire and implemented an absolute ban on the targeting of civilians, unquote. They then refer to a few of Mladić's own orders. We will now look at one of them. This is exhibit P812 on the screen before you. It is one of the orders the defense relies upon in its brief to say that Mladić instituted an absolute ban on offensive fire and targeting civilians. Looking at the text of this order, under item 2, it states that offensive actions cannot be undertaken without the approval of the main staff. And under item 3, Mladić states that fire is forbidden on civilians, quote, without my approval, unquote. As General Smith at page 7462 succinctly stated, when things are based on the approval of the superior command, quote, that's not the same as banned, unquote. These are not complete prohibitions or even remotely exculpatory orders. What they do show is that Mladić's approval was necessary for firing on the civilians of Sarajevo, which is how the VRS worked. These kind of orders are addressed in greater detail from paragraphs 637 to 644 and 646 to 650 of the prosecution's final brief. As can be seen from these sections of our brief, the documents the defense relies upon either represent Mladić's modulation of the campaign or his attempts to deny or deflect international criticism. Although the defense tries to paint a picture of the accused as a kind man who cared about civilians, as the prosecution has shown, the evidence in this case tells an entirely different story. As Mladić himself bragged during the interview mentioned by Mr. Teager earlier, quote, whenever I come by Sarajevo, I kill someone in passing. That's why the traffic for Sarajevo was disrupted. Snipers. I go, kick the hell out of the Turks. Who gives a fuck for them? Unquote. That's P1974. As Mladić's own words made clear, he didn't care about the well-being of Muslims in Sarajevo. Also, as Harlan explained at pages 724 to 725, there was a direct connection between General Mladić's statements and the effects on the ground. So given Mladić's own words and his actions where he directed attacks on the civilian parts of Sarajevo, there is no wonder that life for civilians in the city was, in the words of Banbury, almost unbearable. While describing the accused as a benevolent commander who constantly controlled SRK fire by restricting it, and who ensured the freedom and well-being of everyone, the defense shifts at times to a depiction of the SRK as a reactionary force with little or no means available to it. These arguments taken together are basically asking you to find that Good Samaritan Mladić was doing all he could with what little he had in the SRK. This depiction of the SRK doesn't hold up either. In fact, the defense's false narrative about the SRK falls flat on its face from the outset. Paragraph 1714, as part of the attempt to say the SRK was at a distinct disadvantage to the ABIH, the defense mistakenly argues that the formation of the SRK came in response to the ABIH's establishment in Sarajevo. They rely on expert Kovac for this proposition. However, Kovac, their military expert, couldn't even get incredibly basic information on the formation of the opposing forces correct. And he was confronted at page 41605 with exhibit P7676, an order showing that the ABIH was actually formed after the SRK, not the other way around. Contrary to the defense's claims in paragraphs 1711 to 1712 and 1717 to 1725, the SRK was not an undermanned, undertrained, and under-equipped force compared to the ABIH. General Wilson said at pages 4008 to 4011 that the SRK was well equipped, very well organized, and fought professionally. This was also the SRK's own view of itself, as illustrated in P6543, where in January 1995, General Mladić commended the 1st Romania Infantry Brigade for being a highly organized and effective force throughout its long history of military successes. By comparison, it was the ABIH First Corps in Sarajevo that was ill-equipped and disorganized. General Wilson described the ABIH forces at page 3922 to 26 as a ragtag bunch at the beginning of the war, and far from a competent force. Although the ABIH improved over time, Koenig said that even in 1995, the ABIH was not a professional army. That's P1741, paragraph 28. And contrary to the defense submissions, the SRK and the RS MOOP were well aware during the conflict that the ABIH was inferior. For example, in 1993, 1st SMBR member Desimir Sharanats reported in P6790 that discipline in the ABIH was non-existent. The men were unruly and they had no uniforms. In P6769, the RS MOOP reported that same year that the ABIH forces were, quote, in disarray. MTFS provisions are very poor, and they have nothing to offer in resistance to the far better armed VRS units, unquote. And lastly, in 1995, SRK Colonel Marco Lagonia reported in D1273 that the ABIH was unreliable and weak in combat. Also contrary to the defense assertions, the SRK possessed superior weaponry over the ABIH, a fact even defense witnesses confirmed. In both his statement and at pages 23868 and 23872, Kecmanović stated that Serb artillery was superior to the ABIH artillery. General Milovanović, the accused's immediate subordinate, indicated at pages 17101 to 02 that the SRK had the advantage in heavy weapons. And again, even defense expert Kovac stated in his report at page 62 of D1369 that the Serbs maintained their heavy weapon advantage in Sarajevo until the end of the war. Finally, the aforementioned Desimir Sharanats admitted at page 26179 that it was, quote, widely known, unquote, that the ABIH had a shortage of ammunition and weapons. The discrepancy between the limited weaponry in the city and the SRK heavy weapons in the surrounding hills was aptly described by volunteer firefighter John Jordan, who said, quote, "The violence in and around Sarajevo was basically shoveled downhill and spooned uphill," unquote. Transcript page 1824. One of the more blatantly false statements about the SRK comes in paragraph 2098, where the defense states, quote, "At no stage during the conflict," unquote, did the SRK have trained snipers or use them. The SRK had snipers, and the evidence shows that the SRK sniping was actually part of an organized and centralized effort to target the civilian population. For example, the VRS prominently discussed its snipers in the 1992 VRS Combat Readiness Report, Exhibit P338. On page 10, in the section on command and control, the organized training of scouts and snipers is described as one of the most important elements for the combat readiness of the Army. Another is Exhibit P677, which is now coming onto the screen before you. This is the 1995 VRS main staff program for snipers. And it shows just how central the main staff was to their instruction. Right at the beginning of the document, the main staff states that sniper courses are organized at the corps command level, and they were held several times a year. This regular sniper training provided, quote, "high-grade professional training," unquote. And snipers received instruction on 7 subjects, including the effect of a sniper in a populated area. As these materials demonstrate, not only was there training of snipers, but it was the main staff who oversaw and ensured SRK snipers maintained their lethal capabilities. The fact that SRK brigades possessed trained snipers and kept training them throughout the campaign is something you can see also in documents from the individual SRK brigades. For instance, the 1st Romania Brigade possessed and trained snipers from the beginning of the war. This can be found in P6543. And the same brigade specifically reported on 29 October 1993 that, quote, "Over the spring period, we trained all snipers from the lower units," unquote. That is P676. Defense witness Mladić, a former member of the 1st Romania Brigade, even admitted his brigade had snipers, quote, "per establishment," unquote. This is in D658, paragraph 25. The defense also makes claims in paragraph 2100 of its final brief that no orders were ever given to snipe civilians, and that no orders were ever received by any member of the SRK to this effect. These arguments make no sense in the context of Mladić's own acknowledgement in March 1995 to General Smith that the SRK's increase of sniping of civilians was in response to Serb casualties from an ABIH attack. That is Exhibit P876, page 4, and transcript page 8222. Also during March 1995, in P7809, a UNMO patrol was present when a 1st Romania battalion commander ordered his subordinate to fire on anything that moved, whether they were soldiers or civilians. In P7810, the same UNMO patrol confirmed this battalion commander's order when it was echoed by SRK soldiers on the front line, who told the UNMOs that they will open fire on anybody who moves, including women and children. At the end of the day, the defense has to run away from acknowledging the existence of SRK snipers during the campaign because there is no justification for how the SRK used them. As Banbury stated, quote, "There was no reason for the Serbs to be sniping in Sarajevo. There were no military targets suitable for sniping," unquote. He then emphasized the fact that civilians, including women, children, and the elderly, were regularly victims of sniping. Van de Weyden explained the effect of snipers and stated, quote, "A victim killed by a sniper only affects the victim and the people in the direct vicinity. But the thought of never being safe from the enemy affects everybody. Apart from being shot at, the anxiety mainly comes from not knowing where or how or exactly when the sniper will strike," unquote. In other words, the only explanation for SRK sniping civilians was that it was intended to inflict terror amongst the population. The prosecution at this time is going to address one unscheduled shelling that the defense raises on a number of occasions in its brief. It's the Vasha Mishkina shelling on 27 May 1992. Like many other instances, the defense theory on this shelling is not clear, vacillating between unsupported conspiracy theories involving staged explosions with a planted device and unfounded accusations that the ABIH were the ones who fired the mortar. Contrary to the defense assertions in paragraphs 1885 to 1905 of its brief, the shelling of the bread line on Vashka Mishkina Street is not part of Scheduled Incident G1. This was acknowledged by the defense at transcript page 39134. For the shelling, the defense relies on former SRK member Bukva in paragraph 1869, whose claims about the Vashka Mishkina shelling were based on intelligence from some unknown source that the BIH authorities staged the event by planting an explosive device. This planted device theory, which has no support, is then contradicted and not relied upon 5 pages later in the defense brief, where the defense states in paragraph 1891 that the explosion, quote, "could only have been," unquote, caused by an incoming projectile. In this later discussion, the defense abandons its previous explosive device theory. They instead rely on the content of Zorica Subotic's report and her twisted attempt to place almost all of the firing positions within ABIH territory, based upon an almost vertical angle of descent of 83 or 84 degrees. This discussion completely ignores what happened during her testimony in court. With respect to the Vashka Mishkina shelling, Subotic's opinion was exposed at pages 39597 to 39602 through her admission that her co-author intentionally altered a photo from the investigative file. This was done in order to make the crater appear like an almost perfectly spherical shape, consistent with a high incoming angle. Her claim that there was no on-site investigation at the time, which is repeated in paragraph 1899 of the defense brief, was wrong. The official investigation report admitted as part of D-1243 unmistakably states that an on-site investigation of the crater was done shortly after the shelling. The same investigation report, which Subotic indicated she knew about, but nevertheless did not reference as part of her opinion in D-2117, undermined her vertical firing theory and showed that the firing points came from a greater distance. Eventually, at page 39609, Subotic conceded that the angle of descent was much lower than the 83 degrees she tried to initially sell to this chamber.
you should slow down a bit.
Thank you very much, Your Honors.
The court reporter can't follow.
Thank you. The defense brief relies on Subatich's report as if none of this ever happened.
I think
I'm not sure
you
where we're at.
provided the text in advance to the
Yes.
transcriber, and therefore you should perhaps take it up from Subotic indicated she knew about, but nevertheless did not reference as part of her opinion. If you restart from there, perhaps, then there's lesser chance that either things appear in the transcripts which you have not read yet, or that things are left out.
Thank you very much, Your Honors. In reference to D-1243, the same investigation report, which Subotich indicated she knew about, but nevertheless did not reference as part of her opinion in D-2117, undermined her vertical firing theory and showed that the firing points came from a greater distance. Eventually, at page 39609, Subotich conceded that the angle of descent was much lower than the 83 degrees that she originally presented to this chamber. The defense brief relies on Subotich's report as if none of this ever happened. Subotich's vertical firing theory, which would have also required the shot to have been fired in close proximity to the point of impact, is also undermined by the fact that the surviving witnesses who were waiting in the bread queue did not hear an outgoing round before the shell impacted. This can also be found in Exhibit D-1243. In paragraph 1897 of its brief, the defense discusses the intercept related to the Vashka Mishkina shelling and how it was against Mladić's orders. But they fail to mention the part where Gagovich is informed of the shelling coming from his own SRK forces on Trebovich, and where he states in response, quote, "Who the fuck is firing from up there?" unquote. They also do not mention Exhibit P-4359, Mladić's 27 May order telling all units to be ready to open fire, but giving no order to fire during ongoing negotiations related to the barracks evacuations that day. As further detailed in paragraphs 925 to 932 of the prosecution's brief, Mladić then did order the SRK to carry out a citywide bombardment of Sarajevo the next day. If anything, this intercept demonstrates how Mladić was central for the approval of all aspects of SRK's mortar use, all the way down to the firing of 82mm mortars. Anyway, with respect to the Vashka Mishkina shelling, the shell that landed on Vashka Mishkina Street on 27 May came from the SRK, and it was not part of some grand conspiracy or the ABIH launching a shell straight into the air so it could fall on themselves. Lastly, in paragraph 1898, the defense brief relies on Mladić's denial of the Vashka Mishkina shelling and his attempt to deflect responsibility through his own self-motivated claims about an investigation, There are no records of investigations into into shellings at the end of May and early June 1992. And if there had been investigations at the time, General Mladić would have had to look no further than himself to find someone who was responsible for the bombardments of the city. This brings us to our next topic. Underlying many of the defense claims are overstated assertions that seek to vilify the ABIH for everything that happened in Sarajevo. These attempts are not new. For example, from paragraphs 1827 to 1835 of its brief, the defense's attempt to blame utility cutoffs on the Muslims perfectly replicates Mladić's own strategy for hiding his force's responsibility as outlined at the 16th Assembly session. During that speech, he stated that his forces would shut down the electricity, gas, and water in Sarajevo, as he had previously done in Croatia, while wisely telling the world that the Muslims had done it and the Bosnian Serbs were doing the best to repair it. That's P431, pages 38 to 39. As we have seen, the truth was far different, and Mladić actually determined whether and how Sarajevo would receive the supply of utilities. The defense does not stop there. Starting at paragraph 1853 of its brief, the defense goes as far as to assert that the Bosnian leadership and the ABIH were the true perpetrators of the shelling and sniping campaign conducted against the civilians of Sarajevo, as if the entire 3.5 years of SRK shelling and sniping can be justified or explained entirely by the Bosnians firing on their own population. Even the defense evidence doesn't tell you this. For example, D1425, an independent newspaper article which the defense relies upon in paragraph 1856. This article discusses views expressed by some unnamed UN officials who emphasize that the suspicions of BIH attacks, quote, were a tiny minority among the regular city bombardments by Serbian forces, unquote. As this article also demonstrates, the defense relies on speculative claims that have routinely been shown throughout this case to be either generic, unsupported, or based on a witness's knowledge of media reports. Ultimately, these speculative claims have proved to be unfounded when exposed to any kind of scrutiny. In many instances, central parts of the defense's narrative are based on non-existent evidence. Take the evidence of VRS propagandist Milovan Milutinović. In paragraph 1862 of the defense brief, they rely on Milutinovic's recitation of a direct quote of Martin Bell, who supposedly stated, quote, I felt like a poor foot soldier in an army whose entire Muslim command lost their mind and terrorized their own people, unquote. The problem is Bell never said this. On the slide before you, Milutinovic's quotation of Bell is on the top, and the actual quote of Bell is on the bottom. What Bell actually said was, quote, I felt like a humble foot soldier in an army whose high command had taken leave of their collective senses, and I told them so, unquote. On pages 30056 to 58, Milutinović was confronted with Bell's actual quote. which shows that Bell was actually discussing the actions of his own government, not the Muslim command, and he did not mention any ABIH terrorizing of their own people. When asked how on earth he got Bell's quote so wrong, Mladić stated he did not speak English and tried to blame the error on a local paper he read in Serbian, ignoring the fact that in his statement, he had very misleadingly attributed the direct quote to an English language newspaper and not to any other source. The defense also tries to point to specific instances where the ABIH supposedly fired on themselves. The first of these supposed events that the defense points to can be found in paragraph 1855, where they assert that Captain Hansen told Bosnian officials to stop firing at their own people after the shelling of the RTV building on 28 June 1995. This claim is solely based on the testimony of UNMO Uyn. When directly asked about this specific event at page 43196, Uyn stated he couldn't tell us about it and, quote, "I don't remember. I was not there, and I can't confirm anything of this," unquote. In addition to not exactly having an inspiring basis for their assertion, there is ample evidence, which the defense ignores, that it was in fact the SRK who fired the modified air bomb that impacted the RTV building on 28 June 1995. This is supported by the evidence of witness Brenskag, who saw the modified air bomb launched from the VRS side of the confrontation lines, and also Harland, Banbury, and RM-110, and exhibits P966, P991, P752, P6711. The complete investigative file admitted is P7572, D203, and D165. Finally, the SRK report admitted by the defense truly underscores the disingenuous nature of these submissions. The SRK, in its own report, admitted as Defense Exhibit D147, acknowledged that the SRK were the ones who fired and hit the RTV building on 28 June. They leave mention of this out of their discussion of the shelling. In a related effort with respect to the tram snipings, the defense tries to rely on D1810. This is that single cherry-picked document from an October 1994 BIH MOOP investigative file. The prosecution tendered the whole file in rebuttal as P7852. This file clearly shows that the information relied upon by the defense was mistaken, and the fire actually came from the SRK positions in Grbavica. In addition to the ballistics evidence in the complete file, the materials reveal that witnesses even heard multiple bursts of fire coming from the SRK positions on this occasion. Then there is scheduled incident G4. The shelling of the football match on 1 June 1993 in Dobrynja. On this one, the defense also claims the ABIH fired the shell. And at paragraph 1946 states, quote, "A number of ABIH artillery positions were located upon the estimated bearing of the projectile, including those within the Toplik area, and it is possible that the projectile could have originated from one of those positions," unquote. In support of this, the only witness they cite is John Hamill, problem is that John Hamill was a UNMO on the Lima side, not the Papa side. And the artillery positions in Toplick that he is describing in the reference part of the testimony belong to the SRK and not to the ABIH. The fact that these were SRK mortar positions in the area of Toplick was also confirmed by SRK Artillery Commander Savo Simic, who even indicated his mortars in the area were pointed towards Dobrynia. The only evidence in the record is that it was the SRK who possessed mortars in the Toplick area. In addition to the false Toplick assertion, the defense then throws out in the next sentences of the same paragraph the possibility that a mobile mortar was used to launch a shell originating from the same direction. This time they rely on a completely unrelated part of Hamill's testimony that has nothing to do with G4. This whole theory is absurd, but if we could look at a map anyway, just to see the supposed route that the ABIH mortar crew would have had to have traveled. This is an annotated cutout of the map marked by John Hamill and admitted as P539. On this map, the road between Dobrynia and Toplick is marked in red. Based on this route, this mobile mortar crew would have had to have driven out of Dobrynia and into SRK territory. They then would have had to have passed through Lukovica, where the SRK command is located, and then continue on to the vicinity of Toplick. This entire area is littered with SRK artillery and mortar positions, according to the evidence of Savo Simic. And you would think that an ABIH mobile mortar crew pulling up to SRK positions and firing off a couple shots would have gotten at least a mention in their daily combat report. The combat report from that day has been admitted as D1778. And no, that report states that there were no unusual incidents on that day. In reality, there's absolutely zero evidence that any of this ever took place. For G4, the evidence in this case conclusively shows that the minimum firing distance of the shell places the origin of fire within SRK territory, and this is just a desperate attempt to try to say otherwise. Your Honors, I see that we're out of time for a break, and I'm about to head into a new section.
We are, Mr. Weber. We'll take a break. We'll resume at 5 minutes to 11 o'clock.
All rise. We vous lever.